Hello, and welcome to our weekly environmental news program. I'm Dale Willman. I run the Resilience Media Project at the Columbia Climate School. This program is being produced in cooperation with the Society of Environmental Journalists. SEJ sends out a daily email roundup of environmental news. It's free to subscribe, and I suggest that you do. Look for it at sej.org. Long ago, I heard a very successful attorney talk about how he approached a trial. He said very simply that his first task is not to discuss evidence or claim guilt or innocence. His first job was to define the playing field, its shape, its scope, and the rules under which the players are bound. If he could do that, he said, he would more than likely win. We see this in life every day. You need look no further than at the current events on Capitol Hill and the debate over the playing field that consists of the duties of the Speaker of the House of Representatives. It's not at all about how one of the most powerful positions in the country can help the American public. Rather, it's all about defining the rules surrounding the Speaker position, and the winners will control a very important playing field. In the world of economics, the playing field has been stacked against the environment for years. Some would say since at least the 1930s, with the start of the Chicago School of Economics and neoclassical thought. And in my mind, as a non-economist, the most damning rule on that playing field, or at least one of them, is that of environmental externalities, which says the uncompensated environmental effects of production and consumption, which are two pillars of economic thought, and that means pollution, remain outside the market mechanism. And that means not only is the environment rarely on the economics playing field, it's not even in the stadium. So a journalist's job, in part, I believe, is to expand that playing field on anything that we're discussing, to allow more people and more worldviews to have full participation. So how can that happen on the playing field that is economics? Today we have three guests. Before I introduce them, let me first acknowledge what I view as the large white elephant in the room, and that is the fact that the panel today is not only all white, but it's all male. And in setting these programs up, Andy and I always try to include women and people of color. We're usually quite successful in that effort, but clearly I failed in that effort today, and this is on me. But what we do have is some of the leading architects of a new vision for the world of economics, and they have important things to say, so I hope you'll stay with us. So for some introductions, John Erickson is not the hacker by the same name. He's a professor of sorry, John had to say that. He's a professor of sustainability science and policy at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont, and the author of the new book, The Progress Illusion: Reclaiming Our Future from the Fairy Tale of Economics. Review copies are available to journalists. Eric Miller is a sustainability economist and educator. He's the director of the Ecological Footprint Initiative at York University in Toronto. And Mathis Wackernagel, I'm sure everybody is familiar with that name, president of the Global Footprint Network, which is an international sustainability think tank based in California. A quick reminder, don't forget to stay with us through the whole program. We'll be discussing how you can localize the information we're going to discuss in your daily coverage. If you have a question, put it in the comments on the platform you're using to watch us, and we should be able to see that question and have our experts respond. So welcome to all of you. Mathis, let's start with you. While everyone watching should be familiar with the concept of an ecological footprint, could you just give a brief definition?
Thank you, Dale. You should consider stand-up comedian. That was very good. Good introduction. Thank you so much. So yeah, actually, it's a quite simple idea. The idea is that the largest farm that exists on this planet is this planet. We live on a farm called Earth. And actually, the regeneration of what the planet can renew is the materially most limiting factor to the human economy. It also limits the use of fossil fuels. They're so plentiful under the Earth, but the amount we can burn is limited by how much the biosphere can take. So the question simply becomes, like, how much is being regenerated? That's the planet. And how much do we use? That's what we call the ecological footprint. So how much is available? That's called the planet, or it's called a country, or it's called a farm. How much we use, that's our ecological footprint. Also expressed in how much area is necessary to support me, to feed me, to clothe me, to absorb my CO2, to have space for my house. And so it's a simple accounting approach just to see how big are we compared to the planet.
And of course, an important part of that is regeneration. Can you describe that, explain what it is, and how this fits into this process?
Regeneration is the essence of life. It renews itself. largely it's called like biomass. Biomass is generated thanks to photosynthesis and the sunlight that comes on the earth, and micronutrients and CO2 from the atmosphere is taken to produce biomass, and that's being eaten in the end by animal life, largely, including human life. So regeneration essentially is the ability of life to renew and to rebuild biomass.
And then, of course, there are processes that can't be regenerated, fossil fuels.
So that's not the regenerative part, yeah. But
Right.
in order to use fossil fuels, we require regeneration because it takes oxygen to burn it, and then CO2 gets emitted. And then if we emit too much, then you change the atmosphere and make it less conducive for human life.
And I'm raising that as our economy is so dependent on this at this point,
It's
on
so
something that will not be regenerative.
And that's what I mean, kind of the lens. That's why kind of regeneration is useful as a lens, because even the non-renewable part are ultimately limited by the renewable parts of the biosphere. Like there's a lot of stuff underground we could dig up, but digging it up destroys the biosphere, and it requires energy to concentrate minerals. And so in the end, all is about competition for regeneration.
Now, Eric, if I can bring you in and talk about Overshoot and explain what that is, and the social implications, the measuring policy, and the two of you, if you can talk about measuring the footprint and Overshoot.
Yeah, sure. And so we at York University in Toronto, we generate the National Ecological Footprint and Biocapacity accounts, in which we tabulate the ecological footprint of all of human consumption, report on a national basis, but we sum it up for the whole world. And that gives us a sense of humanity's ecological footprint. And then we do the similar accounting of the biocapacity, the capacity of the lands and waters across the whole planet to provide humans with those flows of benefits and services that Mathis spoke about before. And when we compare the two, we see that humanity's ecological footprint is much in excess of what the planet can regenerate on an annual basis. And that presents a big challenge for us now and into the future, because if it's the case we want to sustain ourselves and our consumption over time, and also, for example, get to net zero emissions by 2050, that challenges us that we have to figure out a way to reduce our ecological footprint significantly to get it to the level that it can be sustained by the biocapacity of the planet, so that all the countries of the world can achieve their net zero targets by 2050, for example, and the list goes on for us to, make sure that we're not exerting excessive, unsustainable pressures on the fisheries, on our terrestrial lands, and so on. So, and so this concept of overshoot is one that's grabbed the world's attention in an appropriate way, because there is this case now where we've got a 75% greater ecological footprint than can be sustained by the biosphere. So then that raises some obvious questions of what are the things that we can do to reduce our ecological footprint, to get it closer to being within that realm of biocapacity. And so the Global Footprint Network that uses our data to engage the world has put together all kinds of awesome analytics of 100 days of possibilities of all the things that can be done locally, sometimes even individually, sometimes within the household, within the community, on a national basis, on a global basis, to sort of right size our ecological footprint, so that we're not having the concept of overshoot on a one planet basis.
I want to track this into, we're sort of in a defining mode right now, and I want to move it into how do we move that forward in a second. But I want to point out the on your website that you can go individually, and there's the debate individual action versus common action, and which is more effective. But you can go to your website and you can find out what your own ecological footprint is. And I live pretty simply, and I eat low on the biological scale and don't have a lot of meat and all that. So I was happy to take this test this morning, and knowing that I do quite well, and I'm at 5.5 planets. So this is a pretty jarring thing to do when you go through it, and it's a simple tool. It's not you can fine tune it, but it's a basic tool, but it's kind of stark when you start looking at this. Why isn't everybody talking about this? Mathis, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm talking about it all the time. But I think there's this big misconception. That the more we think about sustainability, the more we are carrying our own burden, So Al Gore made this movie called Inconvenient Truth. And I think that's kind of the frame that probably is kind of a little bit the disease as well, because inconvenient truth really implies the more you know, the worse you're off. So why should we want to know? Why should we want to talk about it? And what we would propose is to say that Overshoot will end whether you like it or not. Overshoot, like, it's not a to be acknowledged, it just is. And it will end either by design or by disaster, as Peter Victor says. So by design is probably preferable, I would say. And so knowing your context only has advantages because you can prepare for that future. And I think that's one of the big misconceptions in the world, which we also see at the global climate conferences, that we think, we have to wait for everybody else to act, and otherwise it's not worth acting. But it's actually exactly the opposite. The less others prepare for the future we can anticipate, the more you are exposed to risks, and the more it's important for yourself, whether it's your individual, your city, your company, your country, to prepare for that predictable future. There's no benefit in waiting. There's no benefit in not preparing yourself. So understanding your context only has benefits. That's what we're trying to help see the world. And I think that's the big misconception we try to overcome, that in fact, it's not inconvenient truth. It's very convenient to understand your context because you can make much better decisions.
So I want in half an hour, we're going to start talking about the role journalists play in this and how to get them to visualize and see these sorts of stories and begin reporting on it. But I think in these first few minutes, what we've sort of done, as I talked in the open, is we're defining a playing field and what a playing field might look like. So I want to bring John in and talk for a few minutes about some of his concepts and then have a broader discussion amongst all of us about how we can get this new playing field, how we can get on that new playing field and get started moving this forward. So John, I have four words for you first. Homogeneous globule of desire.
Oh, my favorite quote. Yeah.
Can you just you have to just briefly explain what that is, because I just love the sound of it.
Well, it's a quote from Thorstein Veblen, and he was one of the original troublemakers, if you will, back in 1899, which was this turn between what we called classical economics, which was really rooted in kind of moral philosophy, and neoclassical economics, which was rooted in kind of abstract mathematics.
Well, and I'm going to jump in real quick because this is something that's always fascinated me, the whole idea of invisible hand. I'm blanking. What's his name? Lifting up, classical economists. Anyway, the whole idea that individual action and all that. But the thing that neoclassical economists don't seem to talk about is that when that was written, for instance, if you had a business charter, it lasted for 25 years, and before you could get renewed, you had to show you're doing something in the public good. So the invisible hand, the Adam Smith. The whole
that's what you're talking about.
Sorry, but the whole concept of individual action and all this was fine because it was guided in a sense by a greater business view that you didn't just create things, but you did things in the to a greater public purpose, and your charter wouldn't be renewed until then. So I just wanted to add that about classical before it moves over. So I'm sorry. So you're saying
all flavors of economics are about power relations. And Adam Smith was reacting to his life and times, right? He was trying to sort of take power from the church, take power from a kind of merchant class, take power from the wealthy landowners and sort of give it to the individual, right? So his framing was really about taking power away from church and state and towards the individual. Thorstein Veblen in 1899, your homogeneous globule of desire quote, was reacting to this kind of atomistic version of the human, right? This isolated individual at a point in time who only cared about his or herself, usually a his, didn't care about others, didn't care about the future, just wanted more. And that's what this neoclassical model was constructed around, this rational actor model. And so, my book and our critique of the rational actor model is nothing new. It certainly goes back to Veblen and even before his time.
Okay, so I interrupted you when you're talking about the shift from classic to
Yes.
neoclassical. Is that the point you wanted to make there?
Yeah, and that was the life and times of Thorstein Veblen. This kind of tension between, is economics built for purpose, and what is that purpose? Is that purpose for human well-being? Is the purpose for a good life for all? Is the purpose to sort of live what today we call within planetary boundaries? But the classical economists were also considering how to sort of maintain and sustain a human population from the land. And in many ways, ecological economics, the field that the three of us all contribute to, is kind of come full circle back to some of those same questions, right? What is the moral compass of economics? What is the biophysical basis of the economy? How do we live a good life, but within our means? And that's so much of what the footprint work is about, what the concept of overshoot is about, and what ultimately this larger field of ecological economics is about.
So briefly describe your 4 illusions, because that's sort of central to the theme to the book.
Yeah, so the book is the progress illusion, and there's multiple illusions that I take on here, but certainly one of them is the illusion of the individual. So we were just talking about that, right? This atomistic version of the human, what we sometimes call the subspecies of human, Homo economicus, right? And if you compare economics to other fields like psychology, sociology, if you compare economics to evolutionary biology, the human isn't this independent atomistic creature, is a highly interdependent being, interdependent on other people, interdependent on society, interdependent on all life on planet Earth. So that's one illusion that I take on. The illusion of choice. So much of what we learn in economics is to make choices at the margin, the next incremental step. And we're taught this golden rule, right? You make a choice when the marginal benefit, the next benefit, is greater than or equal to the marginal cost, and then you do it, right? So if you raise your right hand, Dale, marginal benefit equals marginal cost, the three of us can grant you a PhD in economics, okay? Because that's basically what I learned during my doctoral studies. So this is an illusion as well, right? Choice at the margin might make sense at the margin, but I mean, this is the context of the ecological footprint. When you add up all those individual choices over time, you result in an aggregate into a whole that none of the individual choice makers ever would have voted for, right? I'm building my house, I'm buying my groceries, I'm paying my energy bill, marginal benefit, marginal cost, marginal benefit, marginal cost. But when you add up all those together, would I have voted for, a climate crisis, an inequality crisis, a global pandemic, the list goes on and on. So that's what Alfred Kahn, an economist from Cornell, called the tyranny of small decisions. So that's another one of these illusions I take on. You said 4. Do you want me to do 2 more?
Sure.
Okay. There's one which is really the illusion of history. This has changed somewhat in economics programs, but when I went to school, you didn't learn history. You didn't learn economic history. You didn't learn all the rich debates of the past, because the idea was the market model has been perfected, right? And we don't have to go back and read about the classical economists and read about the influence of evolutionary biology on economics and vice versa. We don't have to go back and debate the kind of morality of economics, because that's up to some other discipline to deal with nowadays. Let the philosophers worry about morality. You just have to worry about the perfection of the market model. And that kind of lack of historical perspective, that lack of alternative perspectives on the economics, what we call heterodox economics, lots of different views of the purpose of the economy, is really lacking in traditional economic teachings and therefore in economic policy. And then there's the illusion of growth, which is the the big elephant in the room. Economics has been constructed in such a way that the success of the system depends on growing the system. The metrics that are used are oriented around growth. The kind of health and resilience of the system is oriented around growth. And we sort of tell this fairy tale that the economy can grow forever, and any problems created by growth, guess how we can fix it? With more growth, right? And so, there's lots of circular reasoning. There's lots of biophysical denial. And a big question that I ask in this book and that we've been asking in ecological economics is growth for what purpose? Growth for whom, right? And growth for how long? These are three issues that we really need to grapple with in a 21st century version of economics, not a 18th or 19th century version of economics, which is what we still teach in many of the so-called elite programs.
All right, so the thing I really want to get here, how do we change the playing field? How do we get this conversation out there? How do we show examples, case studies, whatever? How do we begin to change the conversation, change the normal, make a new normal here where the playing field is changed, where these issues are to the fore? What needs to be done to make that happen? That's to me the bigger question that I really want to delve into, and then in a bit talk about how we can get journalists in as a part of that. So I don't know who wants to. Mathis, why don't you go ahead?
I would say on some level, the playing field is changing whether we like it or not. We're entering into new dynamics. We lived in a world that Herman Daly called it like empty world versus full world. In a full world, the dynamics is starting to shift. And the question simply becomes, what's going to be valuable? Because we get the naysayers too often say, oh, we don't know about the future. Of course we don't know the future. We've never known more about the future. We know that people want to eat and sleep. We also know there will be in any scenario more climate change and more resource constraints. And while in the past there could have been externalities that didn't matter, they start to become ever more significant in their as a force, to what extent our assets, our capacities will be able to operate. Some people call it stranded assets. Is our city fit for the future? Is my portfolio fit for the future? Is my country fit for the future? Those who recognize these questions will be able to prepare themselves in time. Those who not will fall behind. So the playing field is already there. Choosing not to see that is at your own detriment. I think that's what is not recognized enough. And I think that's why it's come from, it's not just like in the old world, it was just about externalities where you say, oh, it's about the others. But now those who are not prepared will be at a huge disadvantage.
Let me see if I can put this a different way. You're right. But that's, in a sense, that's sort of like, let's wait until things start going to hell and then people will wake up. And I know it's not what you're saying, but it's kind of, what I'm saying is, how do we get people talking about this beforehand? And to me, a perfect example of a failure of neoclassical is that it's the rational man, right? The rational person today, that they will make their decisions and that will change the market. So what we have is a lot of investment firms who are saying we need to take SDG, we need to take all these factors into account. Our clients are demanding this. This is what our investors want, and this is what we need to do. And you have states like Texas who are saying, oh, then you're not being a part of our. So there's a failure already in my mind of neoclassical economics. That's here is what this model is telling us, and people are saying nope. So what I'm trying to understand is, how do we get past that kind of almost Neanderthal thinking, this kind of it's not even thinking, it's knee-jerk. It's this is what we've always done, this is how we're going to do it. How do we change that level of discussion and get it to where it's, and there is debate within your field about issues. Yes. It's not to say, oh, we need to have groupthink, but how do we change to where at least this is part of the conversation more readily, immediately? I guess that's what I'm trying to get at. I'm not articulating this well, and I'm sorry, but how do we get to the point where this becomes a common part, just a standard? Yes, this will be seated at the table. This is part of the playing field. Eric, you were nodding. What do you think of that?
Yeah, well, I think we need to broaden economic literacy in a broad sense, but I would say a few thoughts as part of that. So one is to appreciate that there are many competing brands of economics. That's the first point I would put out to all, especially the journalists watching this and anyone else. And so depending on the topic you're interested in, or how it relates to things and so on, you should appreciate that just like there's a whole aisle of yogurt varieties available, there's also several brands of economics available to you. And so on this topic that we're talking about today, seek the advice or the opinion or the perspective or a quote from an ecological economist, and you can use their association to find them and help, etc. So that's, I think, one starting point. And then the other thing too is that even without the word neoclassical as the adjective in front of economics you're talking about, which is not going to make sense to a lot of people, I think just focusing on the word economic to challenge that widespread use. The word economics is thrown around, it's put in front of all kinds of other words haphazardly. And like economics in front of development, economic growth. Are we sure it's inherently economic? And I think that's the starting point, is to sort of ask appropriate questions about that and what do we mean by economic. And when we think about economic and economic value, I mean, economic value can be expressed through transactions that we engage with, but it's also expressed through care and other activities that tend not to be transacted in a monetary way. And if we understand that within the scope of economics, we can better understand the role of economists in providing us the world with useful solutions and diagnosis of the problems.
Give an example of that, if you would. Give an example of the non-economic ones that you're just talking about.
Yeah, for sure. Well, outside of the marketplace, there's a lot of care being provided by people for people. Some of it's within the household, some of it's across households and so on. Some people might think of that as sort of voluntary activities, volunteerism and so on, but even beyond voluntary activities, there's so much useful value and work that goes on that's not transacted, but that's really important to us because it provides us with economic value. And in the same way, too, benefits that flow to us from nature. Those provide us with tremendous amount of economic value. It's not transacted through the marketplace. I don't, buy and sell shade. I don't buy and sell clean air and so on. But it's especially important to us. It's valuable to us. It has economic value. It's just not expressed through monetary transactions. And once we appreciate better that scoping, then we can it allows for the possibilities of being more inquisitive about, are we sure that such and such a thing is in fact economic, or maybe it's uneconomic? Because a lot of the transactions that we engage with will have, as you mentioned at the outset, will have these secondary consequences on others in space and time, which you reference as being externalities. They're external to the prices, but they still matter economically. And when we start counting those things, as many of us do as professional economists, and combining that information together with the benefits side, sometimes we realize that some of the transactions that take place in the market economy are not genuinely economic once we make sense of the full values that are involved. So that to me is a bit of an opening. And then I would also even relate that further, if I can drop another quote. I mean, just as John, you were mentioning that quote before from Donnell Meadows about growth of what, for whom, how long, all that sort of stuff too, is refer to Julie Nelson, for example, and even like defining what is economics. And if I remember the quote correctly, something around the realm of how societies organize themselves to provide for the survival and flourishing of life. And, and if that's the starting point, I think that opens up a much broader range of possibilities than the more conventional approach, as you mentioned at the outset.
John, do you have anything you want to jump in? Eric, when you were talking about his quote, I thought you were going back to homogeneous globules, but Donnell Meadows is probably a better place to go with that. John?
Well, first of all, you shouldn't pick on Neanderthals. I'm above average in my DNA with Neanderthals, according to Ancestry.com. There's some interesting evidence of Neanderthal societies that we can learn from. Yeah, I mean, much like we're talking about, this is about a new story, a new narrative, and it's actually a new story that's as old as time, right? It's a story based on care, on cooperation, on stewardship. So, I mean, we've got a lot of unlearning to do. A colleague of mine, Stephanie Kaza at the University of Vermont, used to teach a class called Unlearning Consumerism, and it was like one of these to our students, right? Just like taking their whole upbringing and turning it on its head and saying, this is a relatively new phenomenon for humanity. And this is what it's leading to. And this is why when you consume more, are you happier? Are you healthier? Up to a point, yes, but beyond that, consumption can lead to very dystopian people and dystopian futures. So, I mean, this is what we're wrestling with: a new story, a post-growth economy, a post-growth future. We often use the analogy in ecological economics as an ecosystem going through succession, right? So here in Vermont, if you think of the northern hardwood forest, right, going from farm field to mature forest, the early stages of an ecosystem, the priority is put on growth, on competition, on winner takes all, on resource exploitation, right? But as an ecosystem matures, as the ecosystem gets into those later stages of succession, the emphasis is on cooperation, on resilience, on maintenance, right? On sharing and caring for each other, right? The new research on sort of cooperative management that happens between forest species is like mind-blowing. Same analogy to the economy, right? If we're in a sort of late stage economy, if we're moving towards late stage capitalism, late stage post-growth world, it's going to have a different set of values and a different set of stories. And so my advice to journalists is, don't sniff out the stories where everyone's marching together in the same line, right? Look for these stories over here where people are leaning into their cooperative instincts, leaning into their caring instincts. New stories about sort of building community economies, stories of neighbors working with neighbors. As Eric said, stories outside of the marketplace where so much of our life is lived, but we're taught to sort of bring things into the markets. Price nature, price time, commodify everything, and let the market do our business for us. Yet the secret sauce is in meeting and chatting with one another, having town halls, right? Building trust, shared governance, right? All the things that we're wrestling with at that other end of the spectrum. And the reason that we're seeing the sort of withering of shared governance in our country and others has been a purposeful commodification of everything, a purposeful privatization of everything, a purposeful sort of maneuvering ever since, well, most recently, the neoliberal turn in the 1970s, right, of getting governance out of our lives and letting markets determine everything. That's got to shift. That's the story.
Mathis?
I think the challenge is that we are running a massive Ponzi scheme and we think it's serving us. So a Ponzi scheme, and it's actually a misnomer because there were some women who made other Ponzi schemes before Mr. Ponzi, but history always favors males, as we here also have acknowledged. But so Charles Ponzi scheme. The Ponzi scheme is the idea that you take value from the future to pay for the present. So you rob the future to pay for the present. Financially, it's outlawed in most countries, heavily actually punished. Madoff sat in prison for the rest of his life, and rightly so. Yet on the ecological side, we seem to be encouraging Ponzi schemes. We encourage the extraction of the future to pay for the present. And because we are so focused on just looking at financial income as the key performance indicator, we believe that's actually progress. We're getting wealthier, but we are confusing wealth and income. We're producing income at the cost of our wealth. We're depleting wealth to produce income. And that's
ecological wealth.
The total wealth. Because even though if you say, what's the value of the ecological wealth? Like, for example, in Cape Town, okay, I don't know if you remember, they nearly ran out of water. They never paid much for water. They will never pay that much for water. But without water, the entire value of the city is zero. So the question is not so much what's the value of nature, obviously infinite in some ways, but the question is what's the value of everything else without nature? Zero. So recognizing that, I think that changes it. So I think the big fulcrum is, do we see that we are in the game? We have skin in the game. We're not outside. I think this economic thinking puts us at the outside. Oh, this out there is working. But I think we think it's not in our incentive to see ourselves in the game. And this is old saying about many industries. If you believe, if your salary depends on not understanding, it's very hard to understand. And I think we have this belief, and I love, John, that you mentioned unlearning. I think that's so key. Our problem is not that we don't know. Our problem is that we know too much, but ain't so. And I think Mark Twain said that once. I don't know if it's the exact Mark Twain quote, but it says the problem is not like we're not going to get killed by things we don't know, but what we think we know, but it ain't so. and I think that's kind of the track that we are on, that we think we are outside, we don't have skin in the game, and we are othering the situation. And I think recognizing, do we actually have skin in the game or not? That's the thing. Like the ultimate story, the story we hear, and it's in the resource economics framework. It's called tragedy of the commons, which is a bad name. But the idea is essentially that, yeah, it's bad for the world, but I get the benefits. Why should I give up my privileges to help the world anonymously and I don't get anything back? That's kind of the mind frame we're stuck in. The reality is that we're not stuck in the tragedy of the commons that much. There are aspects. It's not that these doesn't exist, that that some benefits just go to the world and not to me if I'm contributing to sustainability. But in reality, our own interests of cities and countries are much more aligned with the sustainability transformation than what we believe. So I think being stuck in old thinking that doesn't serve us and being blind to the fact that we are in the game, whether we like it or not, I think that's one of the biggest pain points we are facing today.
And an issue for me that a lot of my colleagues will disagree with, but and have when I've talked with them about it, but to me, it's the culpability of the media too. And as you're talking about this unlearning, it's an unconscious thing that we're going through right now. And the media, not just journalists, but the media in general, in the way they portray economy and environment, is I think a huge issue. The fact that so little environmental news is produced. To begin with, when you look at Andrew Tyndall's work out in New York, he looks at all the three broadcast television networks and categorizes their stories. And environment rarely rises above 2%. When it does, it's because of Exxon Valdez. 1989 was Valdez and Alar. Coverage went up to around 11 or 12%. Most of that was crisis coverage. That's not informative. It's only, what happened, why it happened, who's to blame. That doesn't help people understand. When you take out the crisis response stories, it was down below 1% that year of environmental coverage. Anything that's contextual and knowledgeable. But it's more than that. It's the signals that we send. Whether it's through Madison Avenue and buy, you're in terrible shape, you look terrible, but you buy these products, you'll be great. So these messages that are sent that foster a consumerist society. It's also, the hourly Dow's up 5% today, or Dow's down 3%, and that signals to us in a fashion that we're consumptive animals and we need to continue this. So in my mind, and I want to talk about in a couple of minutes here about how journalists can begin to address this. But I want to acknowledge, too, the culpability of the media in sending these messages that continue to reinforce this old way of thinking. I was talking about the investment funds that are being blocked because they're saying, well, we should consider the effect of the environment. Oh, no, that's a bad thing. Those stories didn't really include some of those. It just said these funds are doing this, and here the states are saying, well, you can't come in here then if you're going to do that. There was no context, no understanding, no explaining that there is this different way of viewing the economy. So I want to acknowledge, in my mind, the role that the media plays in that fashion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and then maybe I'll just start off by saying that then there's the role for us as professional economists to inform the world and inform media and inform others with other metrics of significance, things that are important to measure, things that are important to track over time, things that we might want more of or less of, and so on, and not leave it up to everyone to defer to conventional measures of things like GDP, gross domestic product, which is gross. GDP is gross. Well-being is much better to focus on as an ultimate sort of the means and the ends of what it is that we're after. And there's a huge amount of possibility space in that regard. And that's, I think, very exciting for all of us as ecological economists. I mean, the data that we generate around ecological footprint and biocapacity, we do it at various scales as well. And that information can be very helpful because that is information reflecting on things that are scarce. We want more of, things that are excessive that we want less of, and so on, as one component that goes together with well-being, life satisfaction, and so on. Just checking out before this through the World Happiness Reports, on average in the United States of America, the average answer to the 10-point scale of life satisfaction is around 6.97 or so. So the average American, or when you average across all Americans answering on this 10-point scale, 0 being the worst, 10 being the highest, their average life satisfaction around 6.9, almost 7. That's not very captivating. And from that, there's been an analysis done of how much of that answer relates to things that are transacted that are picked up by things like gross domestic product. And the answer is about 25%. The rest is covered by other aspects of things like the relationships, the care, the trust in others, the perception whether there's corruption or not, and so on. And I think, and it's all that stuff in all that possibility space of trying to, figure out how to do better on all that. That's really exciting. And I know John Erickson in Vermont has done work on engaging on things like putting together genuine progress indicators at the state level, or maybe even locally too. And I know several years ago, there was an initiative in Maryland, the state of Maryland, under a former governor, I think Martin O'Malley, that was put together these metrics and so on. It was still early days, so they hadn't quite figured out how to use them to influence policy and decisions and so on, but it was early days. And then since then, a nonprofit has sort of taken them up and continued on that work. And then now with this, as an example there, with the, new leadership there, there's a sort of possibility space there, I think, on sort of redefining progress. What is it that we mean by that? What are the measures that are important? We want more of and less of, and so on. And I think that'll help everyone, especially those in the media business, because, if they want that stuff to report on, we have to make it accessible. We have to provide it to them and provide the context and so on. At the same time, I think it's their role to ask all those in positions of power, when they're reporting on such and such a thing, if they're throwing around that adjective economic in front of it, challenge them. Are you sure it's economic? Was there an economic analysis done in support of that? And you might be surprised to find out that there typically isn't. It's just used as sort of some more as a word without any meaning behind it. So anyways, that's what I thought I'd add there.
There's a lot of things that spring to mind in that. When you're talking about GDP early on, it reminded me of a challenge that I've used since the BP oil spill. And I asked people, I said, was the BP oil spill bad for the economy? And people say, well, of course. So no, GDP went up because of all the Tyvek suits that were purchased, the containment booms, the people hired to clean, and the discounting of the future value of the nature that was destroyed. So it's a lack of understanding there too. But I've heard a couple of good stories for journalists. I love the idea of genuine happiness, 25% of it from GDP and the rest from these other factors that aren't even inclusive in that. And I think that's a really significant point for journalists to be talking about. What is happiness? It's a sense of community. Why do I'm helping a friend move this weekend to his brand new townhome. And it's another development where you drive in and what you see are massive garage doors, and the entrances are on the sideway. There's no sidewalks. There's no public space for engagement. They put up a lovely little gazebo, and it's filled with the mailboxes, so it's not a place to sit. Why do we still build this way? But anyway, the idea of the happiness quotient and how so little of that is involved actually in the economy that we track, and John's genuine progress indicators. I mean, here are two things that journalists can grab onto right now to do stories, to talk about these concepts that we're talking about? What other sorts of things? What other entry points? Excuse me. What sort of other entry points do you think could be useful for journalists to investigate? John, when you and I talked, we talked about farmers markets, and this goes back to the sense of community that we've talked about and the role that farmers markets help in fostering that. So you have other thoughts?
Well, I mean, there are these interesting dichotomies to explore, right? That we've already talked about. So much of the sensationalist news is about the individual, the billionaire, the politician, the person, versus the community wealth, the community well-being. So much of the news is about the short term. You talked about Dow Jones coming out, like, I don't know how many times it's reported on NPR a day, 4 or 5, 6, 10 times. I know this is one of your
hourly on the newscasts.
Hourly, okay.
I do it a lot.
So it's daily, it's quarterly, right? Versus, moving from a short-term frame to long-term frame, right? I mean, long-term stories aren't maybe as sexy, and they don't bleed and they don't lead, but I mean, that's what we're talking about. A real simple way to think about the economy is to really ask the question, are you reporting about the quantity or the quality? And that's been a shift in a lot of these indicators, a very simple mind shift, right? Because we don't want to just produce stuff or consume stuff for its own sake. Bigger isn't better, right? We don't need to just crank out more stuff. The conversation we're having is about the quality of the economy, the quality of your time, the quality of your job, the quality of your consumption. I mean, so much of the starting point is to start to have the conversation about getting rid of unnecessary consumption, right? I mean, a lot of this came out of the news this past year at the climate conference, at the biodiversity conference in Montreal. Some news stories about the carbon footprint of the 1%, the carbon footprint of a private jet, the carbon footprint of consumption that is, as Mathis was saying, stealing from the future in order to support very wealthy, bloated lifestyles in the present. Those are the questions, right? Quantity, quality. The questions that sort of pivot the conversation away for any new job is a good job, any new consumption is good consumption, any new production is good consumption, to no, what kind of jobs do we want? What kind of consumption do we want? What kind of production do we want? And how is it more oriented towards long-term viability versus short-term big splash?
Eric, you're nodding. Do you want anything you want to throw in?
Yeah, and also I think to broaden our concept of assets, to include natural assets as being really important. And I don't know how it works quite in the United States. I'm sorry about your fiscal years and everything else, but for example, closer to here, budgeting done at a local city scale, let's say, or even budgets, at a state or a country level and so on, they'll provide, an inventory of assets and liabilities, and they'll be counting the dead stuff that's within the city, but they won't be counting the living natural assets. And there have been great pioneering municipalities in this part of the world that have realized that we have to be counting the natural assets too, because that provides value to people, even though it's not transacted in the same way as those other assets are. And once, by tracking them so that we have sort of as a measure of the wealth of the city of such and such, the parks, the parkland, the forest canopy, the aquifers, and all that sort of stuff. By including that, then we can also keep an eye on that and see how it's trending over time. We can also be asking all the relevant questions to do with that. Is access broad enough, or where is it in relation to people, and all these sort of things too. And so it's as John was saying, it's not just the quantity, it's the quality, but also like expanding even further of what are the assets that are important to us economically. And so it's the human assets of us and our networks, our stuff, our problem solving ability, our ability to cooperate on challenges and so on. It's of course the built stuff that we, was once really scarce. So we put a lot of effort into counting them, and there's hordes of people that are counting all them all the time. But the real increasingly scarce thing is the natural assets, and we need to put more effort into that. And whenever someone's reviewing the budget proposal at a city level or at a state level or whatever, look through some of the details. They're all in PDF forms nowadays. Control F, search for, word like natural assets or nature or environment and stuff. And if you don't see stuff in there, then ask the obvious question: where is it? What's happening to that?
I love these conversations because it always sort of helps me reframe things too. One of the things I've talked about a lot over the years is one of the issues why we have so little environmental news is because the pathway to being an editor does not go through the science desk or the environment desk, it goes through the political desk. This is why so much of our coverage is who's up and who's down. My master's thesis, I did a survey of Gatekeepers, television news gatekeepers, and my results were what I call my duh moment, which was the gatekeepers who had a higher level of environmental knowledge put more environmental information on the air. But that's one of the problems. There are a lot of journalists who want to do more of these, but it's hard to get them past the gatekeepers. So I have conversations regularly with journalists about how to get around that, because we've got to stop pigeonholing environment. This is an environment story. No, it's a health story. It's a business story. It's a lifestyle story. But as you've reminded me, I'm looking for a workaround. But what I talk about when I'm doing that is quality of life, and those kinds of stories. So you've sort of reframed my thoughts on this rather than just being how do we skate around the editors and fool them into doing more of our stories, but it's actually talking about the quality of life within those communities. I was talking to people in Idaho where a chip plant was coming in, and where were they going to find the homes and what ecosystems were going to be destroyed doing that. And that's a business story, what sort of ecosystem services are being lost, but also the heat that they were suffering through at that time was immense. And I was looking at some of the research on plastic turf on playing fields and how the artificial turf at 90 degrees outside can reach a level of something like 170 degrees at ground level, whereas as grass, regular turf, whatever you call it, it's something like 110. There was a 60 or 70 degree swing between those. Well, that's a health story and a lifestyle story. So it's a long way of saying journalists need to think about, or should think about, quality in that sense too. This is an environmental story, but it's about the quality of life that John, you and Eric have talked about. And I think that's really important. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, journalists are masters in storytelling and how to make stories interesting. And there's one reality around, many environment stories are a bit downers overall. So that, like, how do you make them interesting? And the reason really is, I think people don't read the lines, they read between the lines. And so I think we need to get better at reading between our own lines of what do people get? How do we bring excitements between the lines? One issue, for example, is I think we talk a lot about kind of the need to reduce, and that doesn't excite people as much in some ways. It's kind of, it feels I might have to give something up for the others. It produces resentments if they don't see the neighbor reduce and they reduce. They think what they did was in vain, and so it's a resentment machinery in some ways. And so I think it can be reframed. For example, in my life, I never tell people to reduce their footprint. I tell them to increase their resource security, which is exactly the same thing. It's just the opposite around. They start to realize they invest in themselves. They don't give up themselves for the others. They can have empathy for the neighbor who doesn't know yet how to live with fewer resources because they are at risk. So how do we tell stories in a way that's kind of empowering and kind of feels, why are you gaining? How do we make it interesting? How do we make it into cool stories? Another frame may be also that takes the polarization away. It makes it interesting, intriguing, and inquisitive in some ways, is to tell the story from the perspective of what's going to be valuable. So when you interview city council, you ask them, like, how do we make our city more valuable so it can operate in the future we will be? And you can look from that lens at so many different things. Is it really making sense to build more parking garages? Shouldn't we invest more in bicycle lanes? That's going to be valuable in the future. So it's kind of how to turn the story into something exciting that you inquire and that's not polarizing against each other, but we are building value, we're building capacity for society so we can be successful together. What will it take? And so it's kind of, answers kill inquiries in some ways, but if we are able to bring the questions out in a way that people can have these conversations about what we truly want and avoid to say should, but we really talk about our desires, where do we want to go and what would it take, and bring people in to give us advice, it builds that community and that excitement, and the stories that suddenly start to link, to start to recognize there's no environment. It's everything. It's one. Everything is society. Everything is environment. Everything is economy, and then it breaks down these barriers.
For about a minute, I ran an online newspaper in Saratoga Springs, near where I live now, and one of the prime purposes was to have community conversations, so that you're also listening on important issues, but that it brings up a lot. We got a lot of great stories out of those conversations by bringing people in and just discussing something that was a huge topic at that moment. But it was fostering community, which I think is one of the primary roles that journalists should be doing, and which a lot of publishers have forgotten about. Yeah, I know that you have a hard stop coming up, so I want to do one quick round between the three of you. If you have, and you may not, but do you have any specific concrete journalists should look at this topic, because this is a really good one that will get them into this cycle? So we've had some ideas of looking at genuine progress indicators, those sorts of things, but is there some one or two things that you think right now are the hot thing that journalists should be looking at that would begin addressing these issues? Yep.
So for those more geopolitically inclined, I think now with the war in the Ukraine and resource security, how it affects energy security in Europe and how they deal with it or don't deal with it, and kind of the economic implications of that. It's a beautiful context for looking at the significance of resources, the impact it has, the ability to deal with these issues, and the transformation that we require to have a good life. So I think it's a very topical context.
Great, thank you. Eric? John, go ahead.
Maybe I'll go to the other end of the spectrum, to the local level, because so much news is local news, as you know, Dale. Go back to the theme that we started with, of renewal, of restoration, right? So much of economics and so much of the economic mindset comes from a colonial point of view, comes from a point of view of exploitation, comes from a point of view of a race to the bottom, right? Cheapest labor, externalized environmental costs, cheapest land, deplete, pollute, worry about it later. The stories are about turning that around, right? Moving away from a story of exploitation and colonialism towards a story of fairness, justice, of renewal. I'm reminded of this workbook that a colleague of mine, Michael Kinsley, who worked for years with the Rocky Mountain Institute, put together, called an Economic Renewal Guide. And he thought of a community as a bucket, right? And this bucket has leaks, lots of leaks. But the traditional development strategy is just to keep pouring water in the bucket as fast as you can, right? Give the tax breaks, bring in the Walmarts, bring in the cheap goods, bring in the job providers, the corporations, instead of just looking to your community and say, well, how do we plug the leaks? And there's really simple stories. Like, one of the biggest leaks is the money that you spend on energy. And that goes away from your community right away, right? No one wakes up in the morning and says, I can't wait to pay my electric bill. I can't wait to pay my fuel up my car. That money leaves your community right away. It's not available to recirculate. So simple things like energy conservation keeps money in the community recirculating and creates a new kind of development model that moves towards quality, not quantity. Not pour more money in the bucket, but plug the leaks of your bucket. So these are stories of resilience, of renewal, right? Of building networks, of planning at bioregional scales, of recognizing your biocapacity and living within your means. And when you sit around the table with folks and talk about this, they get excited, right?
And John, I'm going to interrupt very quickly. Dr. Weckenhagel, don't be polite. I know you have to go.
Yes.
Take off. You leave, and we'll wrap up with the rest of it. Thank you for your time with us.
It's awesome. What a great group. And color coordinated, the blue shirts, the black shirts.
Oh, no,
let's do it again sometime. But thank you. You run. And John, I want to ask you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dale. It was wonderful.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. Have a good
Hi,
weekend.
Eric.
And John, really quick, let me ask you, do you have a specific example of that? Can you give us this thing is, there it goes. Okay.
From really boring examples like home weatherization, right, to exciting examples like farmers markets, community-supported agriculture, public banking, cooperative management, the growth in employee-owned companies, community-owned companies, really, really thoughtful ways of kind of refinancing the necessary ecological restoration that's happening. thinking in terms of watersheds, food sheds, energy sheds, right? I mean, really sort of starting to wrap your head around a model that says, I don't just go to fill up my car, pay at the pump, and the costs are externalized on distant people, distant lands, and distant futures. Bringing those costs within my community and also the benefits. Those are the stories. We work with a group called the Next Systems Project, and their whole purpose in life is to sort of assemble all those next system stories that are happening at local levels and ask the question, how do we scale them up and out? That's really ripe territory for new stories, new journalistic efforts.
And you know, you're preaching to the choir here, brother, because that's what my whole fellowship program is
I'm
about.
on my soapbox, so thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Eric, how about you?
Yeah, a few other things. One other point to add in is another sort of concept from economics that is not covered as much, but it should be on people's minds, is sort of the foregone opportunities associated with things, is one way to put it, which I think is really important at a local level, because very often, like, ways of doing things are presented as this is how we do things, or it's all or nothing, and so on. And I think it's important to ask the question of alternative possibilities, because the more that we have this idea of sort of possibility space, the better off we are, because then it helps us to evaluate and make comparisons on them and so on. And if I could just sort of, for the final, I guess, remarks, then when people think about economists and economy, if they think about information associated with that, very often people gravitate just to things that are priced, and they look at the prices of things as an indicator of value and importance and trade-off and all that sort of stuff. Even just within that narrow range, there's a huge realm of possibilities for us to, in sort of a new normal for the economy, as your framing of this, to ask some important questions about whether even the prices that are being charged for certain fees and fines and permits and all that sort of stuff at a local level, and also the fees and also the prices paid for other things that one purchases and so on, like, are those appropriate or not? And there's often terrible injustices revealed within those. So I think there's great news stories there of, in all that realm. And then very importantly too, is to appreciate that prices also, though, do have significant limitations associated with what information is part of that. So we need to be paying attention to other bits of information. And so that's where I think it sort of leads us into that realm of seeking out additional information that's helpful to us to understand what is, what could be, what the alternative possibilities, the foregone opportunities are when we're thinking about everything from food-related things to development things to housing to transportation infrastructure and all the rest. There's great wisdom in asking questions, and specifically questions that are economic in nature, such as the ones I gave there.
John, any last words?
Yeah, ask Dana's 3 questions, right? For whom, for what purpose, and for how long. That's a really good starting point for lots of interesting stories. Question the status quo. That's what this whole book of mine is about, is rethinking what progress should and could be.
Great. And I think we mentioned at one point that journalists can get review copies of your book, so they can reach out to me or to you to see how that might happen.
Yeah, Island Press is a big nonprofit publisher who's published the book, and we can definitely arrange review copies. And
Eric, best place to find out about the work of the two of you and others?
Sure, yeah. York University in Toronto, footprint.info.yorku.ca is where you can find information and data, and to connect with us personally if you have any follow-up questions or like us to speak to your own audiences. Happy to connect with everyone. So thanks so much for this opportunity, Dale.
Great. Hang with me, stay with me for a minute here while I wrap things up, and then we can talk. But that is it for today's program. I want to thank all 3 of you for joining us. Next week, Andy Revkin will have the program. And if you want to rewatch this or any other program in our series, check out Andy's YouTube page. Thanks to all of you for joining us, and I hope you have a great weekend. So long, everybody.